Board to welcome you tonight to the Anne B. Shepard Lecture Series. And as you know, this is the third lecture in our series. The series this semester is called With Regards to Good and Evil, Old Problems in a New Century. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Spring Kernighan, who told me a couple of days ago that he prefers very short introductions. So I actually thought about coming on and saying, please welcome Spring Kernighan, he is my neighbor. But then I read his CD, and I decided that was unfair to him. So he'll probably give me 1 minute. Professor Kernighan has a BA from the University of Toronto. He has a PhD from Princeton University. Until the year 2000, he worked at Bell Labs in the Computing Science Research Center. After that, we were fortunate enough to get him here as professor in the Computer Science Department at Princeton University. He's the author of 8 books and numerous technical papers, and impressive to me, he holds 4 patents. His research areas are programming languages, tools, and interfaces that make computers easier to use. And I guess related to that, he's interested in technology education for non-technical users like me and like many of us probably in this room. And finally, in 2002, he was elected a member of the National Academy of Engineering. So please join me in a warm welcome for my neighbor, Professor Spring Kernighan.
Thank you very much, Deb. Definitely nice neighbors in Princeton. Okay, I'm going to try and talk without the microphone, and if people in the back row can't hear me, please say so now, and then I'll move back. You can hear me? It's okay, good. Because I prefer to be able to sort of wander around and rather than feeling tied, and they didn't give me the wireless mic I was expecting. So, anyway, let me start by doing a bit of a survey. I have been asking this question of audiences recently. Many of the audiences are, younger is a loaded word, have less experience and maturity than perhaps this audience. So how many people here have a computer of their own? Yeah, that's pretty good. I assume everybody has a cell phone. Cell phones? Ah, some people don't. There's a vociferous no. And those of you who do, please turn it off. How many people have a DVD player? And that could include the one in your computer, right? Sort of almost everybody. And of course, most people will have a digital camera. I notice we're being digitally cameraed here. A lot of gadgets, okay? How many people used email in the last, I don't know, a few days? Right? How many people use chat or internet messenger or something like that? Not as many. Okay, that's a difference between a young audience and others. How many people use Google in the last, I don't know, week or something like that? Yeah, everybody. Okay. So, you sort of knew the answers to all of those questions as soon as I asked them in a way. We are clearly surrounded by gadgets, gadgets like cell phones and computers and so on. And we're also sort of in the middle of a network that connects us and the gadgets that makes things like email and cell phones and so on work. So that's the obvious thing. I think the unobvious thing, perhaps, until you think about it a bit, is how recent a phenomenon this is. If I had done that same survey to a similar group 10 years ago, what would be different? Lots of people wouldn't have computers. Most people wouldn't have cell phones. No DVDs, not invented 10 years ago. It's only 7 or 8 years old. Email would be the province of specialists, people like myself in computer science departments. At work maybe, but not at home. And Google. Google's 5.5 years old. It was founded in September of 1998, if you can believe it. So, definitely a recent change. So, what do we got here? We have a bunch of gadgets. One of the things that links them together is that these are all digital gadgets in a way that we will see. And so what? Yes, it is working. So D is for digital. These things all represent information in a digital way. They process digital information. They pass it around in a digital form, as we'll see. And the physical devices that do that are getting smaller and cheaper and faster and better at an exponential rate. Every year, things are substantially better than the way they were before. And so the reason it matters is that that combination of pervasive stuff and extremely rapid change means that everything is changing around us. We're in a time of extremely rapid change, and it's affecting our society, the world we live in, the way we live, what happens to us in all kinds of ways. So that's why it matters. Now, I suppose I could impose on your hospitality or something and stand up here and talk about the effects of digital technology on society. As you can imagine, I wouldn't be able to pull it off, and people would be asleep instantaneously, including me. It's much too big a topic. I don't know that much about it anyway. So what I thought I would do is to focus on one topic, which is a small piece of that, perhaps. We're going to talk about digital music. Digital music is one of those things. Music is obviously important to a very large number of people here. And digital music is a place where all of the interesting changes and the forces that I want to talk about are coming together all at once in a way that very much changes the lives of people, in particular changes the lives of the students right here at Princeton. So the way I want to do this, I want to start by playing a piece of music, a piece of actually digital music, strangely enough. I'm going to play it, and then we'll tell you a story about it. So, a piece of music is something called the Miserere. It's a setting of Psalm 51. It was written in about 1638 by Gregorio Allegri. He was a chorister in the papal choir. They sang in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So I'm going to play this thing. The piece as a whole is 13 minutes long. I'm only going to play about a minute of it, just so you get a sense of it. And then when it's finished, I'll tell you the story that goes along with it. Okay, so let's see if the sound part of this works. Pretty good even here. This music, as you can imagine, was well thought of by popes. It was written during the time of Urban VIII, and he and all subsequent popes really liked the music a great deal, and so they basically kept it under lock and key. The music was not published, it was not available to anyone else, it was sung only by the papal choir in the Sistine Chapel during Easter week. So if you wanted to hear it, that was the deal. And furthermore, at least by repute, it was an excommunicatable offense to violate any of these strictures. So things stayed in that state. You had to be in Rome to hear it until 1770, 130 some years later, when a 14-year-old kid showed up, heard the music, rather liked it, went away, wrote it down perfectly from memory. Well, the story gets a little fuzzy at this point, but somehow his transcription found its way into the hands of an English music publisher. Being Protestant, he wasn't as deeply concerned about excommunication as others. And so the music very rapidly spread all over Europe. And in that way, broke the Pope's monopoly on this music. It was sort of an early example of music sharing, I think. And the kid, for those of you who hadn't guessed, is, of course, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So anyway, now, if you could gather together a couple of choirs and a soprano who could sing that kind of thing, then you could have this music anytime you wanted. But it really wasn't a great deal. Things stayed in that state then for about another 100 years, and in 1877, Thomas Edison, the great American inventor, created a device that he called the phonograph, which was basically a way of capturing sound in such a way that it could be played somewhere else at some later time. Now, Edison's original technology was very flaky, but it took a very short time before people started to improve it. It got much, much better quite quickly. And in about the 1890s or so, people started to record things that were quite interesting, recordings that are still with us. And I thought I would play one of those for you just so you can see it. So this is Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson was born in 1809. He died in 1892. In 1854, he wrote perhaps his most famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, commemorating a slightly less than successful military venture. And in 1890, he was captured reciting this famous poem. And so I'm going to play you a little bit of it. It comes from a wonderful CD produced by the British Sound Archive. And I put the words up there because the fidelity is not real good. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it to hear one of the premier Victorian poets reciting his own work more than 100 years ago. Just absolutely remarkable. So, what is sound? What happened when Edison did his thing? So sound is fundamentally a vibration, a fluctuation in air pressure. The air vibrates, fluctuates. Our ears sense that, send a signal to our brain. We hear it as sound. And so what you want to do is in some way capture that vibration of the air in a form that you could then reproduce by vibrating the air somewhere else later on. And you can sort of see what's going on. Here's a picture of the fluctuation of sound over a period of time. This is in fact 1 minute, the minute of the Allegro that we just heard. And the green one at the top is probably easier to see, sort of the left side. On the left end of it, we have the male choir, relatively quiet, then the female choirs coming in, and then towards the right, the very loud part where the soprano is singing. Now you can't see a lot of what's going on there, but what you can do is zoom in on it, and this will be even harder to see, I fear. But this is 25 milliseconds, a 40th of a second, and so you can sort of see the fluctuation. This is about the point where the soprano hits the high C. And so that waveform is in fact the fluctuation of air pressure. And so if you could capture that, you could play music somewhere else by then using that to recreate a vibration in the air. And for the longest time, the mechanism that people used was something, let's see, this. Remember this? I don't have to, for this audience, I do not have to explain what it is. Right, one of these things. So this is what in its form, even today, is called the long playing record. Basically what there is there, as you well know, is a very long spiral groove, and the walls of the groove are sort of, they vary in proportion to the sound that was impressed on them originally, and as it turns, the needle vibrates like this, following the groove, and that vibration causes a current that gets amplified, drives a loudspeaker, and makes a noise somewhere else. And so that's how we can use it. Now those of you who have had LPs, especially really early ones, will know that it was not a perfect technology, right? Scratched very easily, it got dirty all the time. Early ones were extremely fragile. And of course it wore out because as it turned, the needle was making physical contact with the grooves, and so eventually things wore off. In spite of that, in spite of not being a really great technology, it lasted for a very long time, right? It lasted from probably around the early 1900s, or maybe 1920s, something like that. Quite a long time. It was the definitive way that music in particular was presented to everybody. And then in 1982, a new technology came along that killed that essentially dead in about 5 years. And what was that technology? It was that, the CD, the audio CD, right? This. And so this is the CD that we were listening to, and the soprano, Deborah Roberts, in the lower left corner. And if you look carefully up towards the right there, you can see that it says things on it. In a form that we can then use to reproduce sound somewhere else. What does D mean? What is digital in this context? How does this represent sound? And why did it kill the LP so thoroughly dead? So let's look at that. Let's think about sound. Here's a wave. Sort of think of this as zooming in on a very small part of the soprano hitting the high note or something like that. So if this were going to be the groove on a record, you can imagine the needle following this thing and in some sense vibrating in proportion. But another way to capture the information that's represented in that wave is I could just measure it. Let me just say, I'll measure how high is the wave every so often. Do it often enough, I will capture the height of the wave accurately enough that you could almost imagine reproducing. If I take away that, you can see there the height of the wave is represented. It's not great, but you could see that if I measured it much more frequently and much more accurately, like that, then I've really got the wave in some sense. Enough that just the heights of the wave there tell me enough about it that I could reproduce it some other time, some other place. So I could simply say, okay, this is how high the wave is at various points. Bunch of numbers there which represent how high is it. And then what I could do is to say, I want you to have this wonderful little wave, whatever it is. I'll just give you the numbers. Okay? And if I were going to give you the numbers, I'd give them to you like this. It's not really effective, but it's enough that you could then recreate what was going on. And if instead I was going to give it to a computer, then I would, of course, use the ubiquitous zeros and ones that computers use, because that's the equivalent amount of information, but in a slightly different numeric base. And then if I was actually going to give this to a computer to play on a CD, what I would do is this. Take this thing. Very, very shiny. If we had really bright lights, we could do something evil to the camera. It looks like a perfectly smooth, shiny surface, right? But if you look at it up close with a microscope or something like that, what you'll see is that there are smooth parts, but there are also places that are little pits or like potholes on it. And the way this works is as it turns, the laser shines on it. Laser up there. So laser shines on it, and the way that the laser reflects is different from on the shiny bits from the pits. And so as it turns, the laser shining and pattern of reflection is enough to recreate those zeros and ones exactly. And so that's fundamentally what's going on in the CD, and that's the way in which you can take something that looked like this, convert it into basically zeros and ones like this, impress it on this, and then reverse the process and send it off to something else to play real music. Okay? So that's how CDs work. Why are they better? One reason they're better is that they really are compact. They're called compact discs because they're smaller. If you compare this, Jackson Hole's more music than that, you can see that they're smaller. They don't break, they don't wear out with use because the laser just shines on them. So in many kind of trivial mechanical ways, they're clearly better. The other reason that they're better, however, and this is really the fundamental thing, is the difference between specialization, an LP is specialized to music, and generalization. The CD is good for storing any kind of thing, any kind of information that you could reduce to those zeros and ones. So we just saw how to reduce music to zeros and ones, right? Measure the height of the wave. It's pretty easy to imagine how you could reduce letters, numbers, things like that to zeros and ones. And that way you could put on the CD things like the lyrics of the song or the name of the author or all of these other kinds of textual information you might want. You could imagine how you could reduce pictures to zeros and ones. How much red, green, and blue are there in a little place? So you could put still pictures. You could even put movies on a CD. So the CD is a very general device. It will hold any kind of information that can be reduced to digital form. Okay? The other thing, of course, that once you've got information in a digital form like this, you can start to process it. You can start to do transformations on it rather than just sort of copy it from one place to another. And if you're going to transform stuff, then you need to think, how do you transform information? And this brings me to the second piece of my story, the digital computer. So let me give you, if it's okay, sort of the 2-minute history of computing. This will save you from taking some other course at the Princeton Medical School. Sorry, guys. So the history of computing, certainly the early history of computing, is fundamentally an attempt to do arithmetic by machine because people are so bad at doing arithmetic. And I guess my story would start with an Englishman named Charles Babbage, who was born in 1791. And Babbage was very much involved in computations for doing astronomy and for navigation. astronomy, where are things up there? Navigation, where am I down here? All of those required basically a lot of numeric values, which were things that went into formulas to compute where things were. And Babbage found that this was exceedingly hard to get done. It was hard to get this stuff done accurately. And at some point he said something really quite wonderful. He said, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." Well, this is sort of a weird image in a way. But think about when Babbage is saying this. This is 1821, well before the invention of a gasoline engine, well before the invention of electricity, 60 years after the invention of the steam engine. So metaphorically, for sure, and probably even literally, he's thinking that's the power source for doing computations. So Babbage spent the rest of his fairly long life trying to build machines that would do arithmetic by machine rather than by hand. Now, he never quite succeeded. His technical ideas were quite sound, but his political and economic ideas were not so sound. He was not a very political animal. He alienated all of his funders, and therefore he ran out of money, a common economic issue. However, as I say, his designs really were sound. And in 1991, in honor of the 200th anniversary of his birth, the Science Museum in London decided that they would actually build one of his machines using the technology of the 1830s and 1840s, using the materials, using his original plans. And they actually built one of these things, and there's a picture of it. I apologize, it's a little blurry. It's hard to get a sense of the scale of this thing. But if you look over in the lower right corner, this little bar, that's a handle for two hands. So this thing is 11 feet long, it's 7 feet high, and it's about 1.5 deep, and it weighs 3 tons. So it is not a portable computer, unfortunately. So Babbage's work in the 1830s and 1840s, great stuff, but in effect, nothing ever came of it directly. And again, we're in one of those 100-year fallow periods, if you like. And then during the early days of the Second World War, there was a lot of pressure to be able to compute better, primarily things like trajectories for naval shells and that sort of thing. And there were a lot of computing efforts that went on. One major one went on at a rival institution up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Harvard. Harvard and IBM jointly made a machine called the Harvard Mark I, and as you can see, it's an enormous device there. Those are people, that little blurry bit over towards the right. Just a truly huge device. It was not, as it turned out in the long run, a success. Certainly for a while it actually worked well, but it was a mechanical device, and mechanical devices turned out to be an evolutionary dead end. And at the same time, going on in the other direction from here at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia was the more familiar and ultimately the successful computer effort. This was ENIAC by Eckert and Mockley, and this was done in about this picture is probably 1946. This was a pure electrical device. It had, in effect, no moving parts. And so all of the machines that we use today, the one that I've got hiding over here, all of the ones that you folks have, are the logical descendants of that ENIAC machine. You can see both of these, or more precisely, you can see pieces of them if you're ever up at Harvard. Drop in at the Science Center, and there's a big chunk of the Mark I there, and down in the Moore School at Penn, there's a chunk of ENIAC as well. They're kind of interesting historical artifacts. You can see how far we've come. So what you should remember, my 2-minute computer course, like many things gone on too long, but what you should remember about computers is first, a computer, whether old like this or modern like the ones we have, is fundamentally just a calculator. It's not much more than those little pocket calculators that we used to have. It only does arithmetic, but boy does it do arithmetic fast. It does billions of arithmetic computations in a second. And it does all of those computations under its own control. It decides what to do next on the basis of what it has just computed. So it's really sort of in charge of its own destiny for a lot of purposes. Another thing about the computer is that it's a general purpose device. It stores in its memory the data that it's working on, obviously, but it also stores in that same memory the instructions that tell it what to do to the data. And so, if you put in new instructions instead of those older instructions, then the machine does something different. So in that sense, it's a general purpose device, and that's the reason why your computer or mine can be doing things like showing pictures and playing music and playing games and doing your taxes and surfing the web and reading mail and all of these other things that we do. just loading in different sets of instructions into the single general purpose device. Fun. To me, the most interesting thing about that, perhaps, is that that notion was seen absolutely clearly by Babbage in the 1830s. And so everything we've done since is fundamentally just making those ideas work well. Okay. So what's happened since EAC 1946, something like that? Fundamentally, steady progress, but sort of at an exponential rate. Every year or two, things are twice as good as they used to be. Let's look at one intermediate stage, which again might be familiar to many of you. Remember this guy? Some of you certainly do. This is the IBM PC, which came out in 1981. The IBM PC was it wasn't the first personal computer, it wasn't the first cheap computer or anything like that, but it was the first one that was personal and cheap and came from a company that you'd heard of and thought would still be in business in another couple of years. And so it sold like hotcakes. It was extremely popular. This was 1981. I said that the CD came along in 1982, and it was a very short time indeed before those two things got together. And so you had CDs, CD drives, in PCs that you might have in your own home. So that meant it was now possible to use your computer to play music, but it wasn't possible to do much more with it than that because the machines weren't really very powerful. They didn't have very much memory or other storage. But that changed fairly rapidly. Over the next 10 years, what happened is that machines got faster and our understanding of what to do got better. And so at some point, it became possible to take sound in particular, the kind of digital music that we saw, and do interesting transformations on it. And the most interesting transformation for many people turned out to be something called compression, and in particular a compression technique called MP3, which would take basically the sound that is on that, 600 megabytes, this much stuff, and squeeze it by a factor of 10, so it's only this big, and didn't change the quality. It still sounded just the same to your ear and mine. But it only took us 1/10 as much space, or if you wanted to send it to somebody else over a telephone line or something like that, it went in effect 10 times as fast. And so that changed things quite a bit. And so think about, here's the picture in about 1997, 1998, or something like that. Okay? I'm putting it in terms of the students here at university, but you can think of your children, your grandchildren, or even yourselves. Every student has a computer just like everybody else here does. And of course, every one of those things has a CD drive on it. And the software that does this compression is widely available. You can just download it from the internet. So everybody has that software. And then, of course, every student does have an internet connection. That's one of the things that universities pride themselves on, is providing connectivity for their students. So here we are in 1998 approximately with this. And so what happens is we're right on the edge of what you might describe as a perfect storm. It's a tipping point in some sense. And all it takes is one tiny, tiny destabilizing force, and the world changes. And this is the destabilizing force. His name is Sean Fanning. He was at the fall of 1998, he was a freshman at Northeastern University in Boston. Computer science major, I might add. And he had a really good idea, so good that he withdrew from school, went home, and worked on it for the next few months. And in May of 1998, he released his bright idea to the internet, just gave it away. It was a program called Napster. And Napster really changed things, because what Napster did was make it really easy for anybody who had music they loved, compressed on MP3 form, to make it available to other people who had MP3 music, etc. And so people took to sharing music in this MP3 form very, very, very rapidly. Napster came out, as I say, in May of '99, and within a year or year and a half, he had 80 million people using it. So this was great. Music lovers everywhere rejoiced. The problem is that the people who provided the music, the recording industry, didn't see, warm, fuzzy people sharing music. They saw theft on a truly grand scale. And so they sued Napster. They won their case. Napster was shut down. And that was in early 2001. It sort of defines the notion of internet time, right? 0 to 80 million to 0 in 2 years. Now, Napster was easy to shut down in a sense because it was vulnerable. First, it was vulnerable in a weird technical way. The way it operated, it had a directory of what music was available. Not the music itself, but who had what, on a single machine, conceptually. And so if you could shut down that central machine, you could shut down Napster. So that was kind of a technical vulnerability. And there was also a jurisdictional vulnerability, if you like. They were in California, and so they were subject to United States law, and so it was fairly easy to kill them that way as well. However, the service that Napster provided, this ability to share music worldwide, was so appealing, so popular, that immediately alternatives sprang up that didn't have those vulnerabilities. And this is things like Kazaa and Morpheus and Grokster and LimeWire and BearShare, and anybody who's under 25 can tell me all the others. They were not vulnerable technically in the same way because they did not use a centralized directory that kind of distributed the information about where things were. And they weren't in the United States, so it was much harder to get at them, at least with American law. So what happens? At this point, the Recording Industry Association of America says, well, we obviously can't do anything about the suppliers in that sense. Let's go after the people who are actually supplying the music, the people who are making music available for sharing. And this is the point where this issue came exceedingly close to home. Dan Peng, who's at this point a junior computer science major right here at Princeton, was sued last April. He was one of 5 students in the United States who were sued by the Recording Industry Association of America for what could be tens of millions of dollars. I think it was settled for a lot less than that, fortunately. And it was kind of like a warning shot. The next thing that you saw, not too long after that, you may have noticed this. This was part of a full-page advertisement that I got out of the New York Times. And it's clear what demographic this is aimed at, right? So we have the recording industry enlisting the press in that sense, I guess, or at least the advertising. And then there were also hearings held in Washington. This is too hard to read, but this was a hearing where Orrin Hatch was quoted, and I just want to pick up the one thing. Orrin Hatch said, basically, if people want to share music illegally, I'm willing to destroy the machines. Now, in fairness to Senator Hatch, I understand sort of where he's coming from, because in addition to his day job as senior Republican senator from Utah, he also writes and sells music. And he makes a noticeable amount of money, not enough to retire on, but he makes a noticeable amount of money selling these things. And so if somebody is taking that music and making it available for free, then they are cutting into his legitimate reward for having spent the time to write and perform the music. So, anyway, so what you can see going on here is in effect an arms race between the people who want to share music and the people who want to prevent them from sharing music. And in some sense, the weapons are getting more and more destructive on both sides of it. And it's still going on. So that's music. And if you can pick up the paper almost any day and see some vibration about music sharing, but that's only one example. Think about the other things that we talked about that could be reduced to digital form. Books, very easy to reduce books to digital form. Movies are very expensive intellectual property in a sense, it costs millions. Movies are distributed on DVDs, maybe digital TV when it comes along. All of these things are lumped under this heading of intellectual property, something that doesn't really have a lot of tangible existence, but in this context usually means digital information. If you think about books in particular, if you wanted a book back in the Middle Ages, you went to a scribe copied the book for you. Very expensive, very slow. Gutenberg invents the printing press. Now it's possible to make books in quantity, but it's still hard work to make the first one of them. The Xerox machine comes along in what, the 1960s, and now it's possible to make not very good copies of books, but it's still painful. And if you make a Xerox of a Xerox, it's not very good at all. But think about today. Get a scanner, scan every page of the book, clean it up with optical character recognition, put it on the web, and everybody has got, in effect, a perfect copy of the book. Think about movies. As I say, movies are extremely expensive property. They cost tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars to make a movie. Movies are, at this point, more movies distributed in DVD than in videotape, as of the last year or so. We just saw most people here have a DVD player on their computer, so they have a way to get the bits of the movie into the computer. Deja vu all over again, perhaps. You sort of see the same kind of thing happening. So what used to be specialized, in effect, analog mechanisms, very complicated mechanisms like the LP record that protected intellectual property, the way they protected it, I guess, is you could say that copying one of those things, in effect, was a manufacturing process. When you wanted to copy one of these things, you had to have a plan to do it. The copies tended not to be as good as the original unless you were awfully good at what you were doing. And if you wanted to distribute these things to the rest of the world, that was shipping real products, and it cost real money to do that. The digital forms that we're talking about here don't have any of those limitations. There just aren't any of those. Sure, I want to say. Essentially, none of those actual limitations. So, if the physical limitations don't work anymore on this, what else might you do? Well, this is digital information. Perhaps you could use some kind of digital technique to protect it. You might use cryptography, for example, to scramble the bits that are on a compact disc or something like that in such a way that they couldn't be read unless somebody had the unscrambling device. And in fact, this is fairly common. Let me see if, oh, yes, I want to say that. I've said that already. Let me not say that again. This is the issue with digital things. In fact, there was an article in the Times only a couple days ago that said almost the same thing in the same word. Copies are free. Copies are perfect. Every digital copy is identical to the previous one. And the distribution is free because I put them on the web. Okay, so if the physical limits don't work, what do we do? So here is a CD. It's a different genre, slightly more modern than Allegri. Celine Dion. And the fine print down in the corner, which is probably hard to see, so let me blow it up for you. It says, will not play on a PC or a Mac. So this is, in fact, protected by a digital protection mechanism so that unless you have the right kind of player, you can't play it. At least that's the theory. Now, as it turns out, so here is the CD. If I take this CD, and I take this very high-tech device, it's called a felt-tip pen, and I run a very fine black line, about 1/8 of an inch or something, all the way around it, like this, that defeats the copy protection mechanism. Now, just before, when you present this to a younger audience, they get really excited. It doesn't always work. It's pretty good. However, it should be observed that what I just did is against the law. Okay? This is the first sentence of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998, which basically says no person shall circumvent a technological measure that basically protects copyrighted material. And so what I did is strictly illegal. Okay? So let me pass this down. I'll pass that to Ruth and then to Susan and then to Nancy. Perhaps we'll just go down. You just pass it on. So I want it to be noted, even for channel 30. You want to cover the camera for a second? Another section of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act says that it is illegal to traffic in copy circumvention technology. And so all of my neighbors have now been trafficking. We've all been trafficking together. So it's crystal clear that the law, in some sense, doesn't quite apply as to the way it ought to here. And so we haven't found the right balance between what the law says, what common sense says, what good behavior, morality, or whatever says. I think the issue of how we sort of decide what to share, what not to share, what's legitimate, and so on, is not going to, in the long run, be settled by laws. There will be laws that draw a line somewhere, but I think in the long run, it's going to be settled by economic criteria. If music doesn't cost too much, and if what you get is something of added value over stolen or free music, then people will pay for it. But the price has to be right. And I think the problem, at least with the recording industry, is that their business model hasn't quite caught up with that issue. Okay, So let me talk about a couple more general things. I've mostly talked now about digital music. I think digital music is really the tip of a sort of intellectual property iceberg, that there are a bunch of other things that have that same set of concerns that go with it, like books and music, digital TV. But more broadly, digital technology is, in effect, putting us right in the middle of a whole sea of icebergs of one sort or another. Because it's a technology, like any other technology, it's a two-edged sword, if you like. Most technologies, most of the time, do good with some harm. And I think digital technologies are going to have exactly that same property. You can see it. Email is wonderful. You all use email. It's a great way to keep in touch with your friends and family. The downside, same technology exactly brings you spam. Right? So the good side, the bad side. The technology that makes it really easy for you to go do online shopping at places like Amazon is also the technology that makes it possible for people to track you and sort of get a better idea of what it is you like to buy and where you like to buy it and all kinds of other things that you might prefer not to reveal so much of. And so I think, in a way, one of the immediate icebergs, one of the ones that I guess I would think of as being most concerning, digital technology makes it really, really easy to collect information about us from all kinds of sources, and then it makes it very easy to collate and process that information so that a lot can be learned that wasn't obvious from any single source. And then having that information collected, collated, and now they know things about us, it's very easy to disseminate that information very, very broadly, usually without any practical or legal restraints at all. And so I think one of the icebergs that we're going to face, a serious one, is potentially loss of privacy in a way that might, in some sense, be irretrievable. So that's just one. You want another one that's good for tonight? This is Super Tuesday. How many states are voting tonight? At least 10. Democratic primaries. You perhaps saw the article in the New York Times a couple days ago about Georgia in particular is experimenting with digital electronic voting. I honestly don't know whether that's a good idea or not, but I think that that is another potential iceberg, and you can see there would be lots of downsides if that didn't work well. So more broadly then, I think we are in the early stages of a real revolution. What we have is digital information, collecting information about all kinds of things. It's very, very easy to collect things and reduce them into kind of this universal form of the zeros and ones, digital representation of information. Once we've done that, then we can process them extremely easily with computers. Computers do this processing, continue to get faster and better all the time. The information that they're going to process comes from everywhere on a digital network and goes out to everywhere on a digital network. The internet is pervasive around the whole world, and there's essentially no controls on how information flows around the internet. And then underneath it all, at all the time, the devices, the actual physical gadgetry that's doing all of this for us is getting smaller, cheaper, faster, better, at an exponential rate. So I think what's going to happen, we can see it already, and it's going to get more. Rapid change, accelerating change, and I think realistically disruptive change. It really is going to shake things up. And so I think it raises a bunch of serious questions. And perhaps this is the place. This is supposed to be a series on ethics, and I haven't said a word about ethics. At least I did say a word. But I think that the digital technology raises a variety of serious questions, some of which have an ethical cast, and some of which are more like, not specifically ethical, but how do we wish to live life? So let me pick one that actually is sort of an ethical concern. Where is the line between legitimate, fair use of other people's intellectual property and stealing it? So if I take this record here, the Tallis Scholars, a record that I really, really like, and I make a copy and I put it in my car, I think that's fair use. I'm not sure legally it is, but I suspect that it would be very hard for anyone to argue that it wasn't. If I make a copy and put it in my wife's car, probably still fair use. But if I like it so much that I make an MP3 of it and put it on my website for everybody in the world to have, that's theft, plain and simple, and no ambiguity about that. So where is the line drawn in that? How should the law be phrased? And how do we set things up, both legally and economically, so that we get the right balance between the rights of individuals participating in the culture, companies to make, and authors and all the others to make a legitimate return on their investment of time and energy, and the government's legitimate right to kind of provide a civil society that we work in. How do we balance all of those things? So that's a question I don't know the answer to. Another kind of broad question, I guess, is so what comes next? Let me mention the Napster one again because it's kind of cute. Napster arrived here on all university campuses roughly in the fall of 1999, and it had an amazing effect on the way that people did music. People shared music, they learned about genres that they'd never encountered before, that bands they'd never heard of, all kinds of things. It really, really changed the social life in that aspect, which was a big deal. What's going on right now in our lives that might have that same kind of effect on the way we do business, the way that we actually relate to each other as people or relate to things like music or who knows what else? What's on our horizon right now that we just haven't noticed yet? What's going on in our various fields? You know, I'm a professor at a university. My field wouldn't exist if it weren't for computers, obviously, so that's kind of uninteresting. But my belief is that there's no academic field that is untouched already by computing, digital technology, and I think that that will continue, that every single field, no matter what it is, will be affected by that. And then, of course, the really broad kind of questions, and these are the ones which are, what should society be like? What kind of place do we want to live in? Where do we think we want to go? Do we want to be taken someplace by commercial interests like the recording industry or the motion picture industry? Do we wish to be taken places by the government exercising its, in many ways, quite legitimate right to try and provide protection for everybody? Where do we want to go? Where are we going, and is that where we want to go? And what do we do right now to steer the boat? This is where we want to go. So I think all of these are, in some sense, good, albeit exceedingly general questions. Back in 1620 or so, Francis Bacon, great English essayist, philosopher, politician, statesman, you know, a little bit of everything, said, a prudent question is one half of wisdom. So I think, arguably, I've at least asked some questions for you. This is the easy half. You folks can go and think about the answers. Okay. Thanks. And that the custom of the evening is now you get to grill me. Be gentle, I will do my best. Let me preface before the very first question, which I'll get to. I'm not an expert, and that doesn't even have to be qualified, but in particular, I'm a technology person, right? I'm a computer programmer, and so I tend to know at least a reasonable amount about that kind of thing, but I don't do I'm not a lawyer, I don't know the intricacies of copyright law, and I'm not a historian, I don't know all the details of that, and I'm not an economist, so I can't tell you how it all, you know, long list of I'm not. With that proviso, I'm willing to try to answer questions. Yeah?
More of a comment or a question, open-ended question. I think it was Andrew Carnegie that donated lots of money to set up the public library system, and that was sharing books, and yet here it seems such an illegal thing. So what do you care to comment on that?
So the question was, Andrew Carnegie did what I would characterize as a wonderful thing by setting up libraries all across the United States. And in that way made books available, in effect, free to an enormous population. And so isn't that in some sense against all of this protection of intellectual property? Well, I think we should have more people like Carnegie in some sense, because that was clearly one of the finest things you could imagine doing. And I think that for the most part, what should happen in copyright, this is what was intended in original times. In fact, right back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution basically says, among other things, that authors get the right for a limited time to exploit their writings. And that's the copyright part of things. There's a similar clause for science or inventors and their discoveries, and that's patent. So and this was something put in, I think, by Jefferson, perhaps reluctantly. He thought that there should be no copyright, but realized there ought to be something, or had to be something. And so the original copyright law was 14 years, and the theory was somebody wrote something and they got the right to exploit that, like get royalties from books or something, for 14 years, and at that point, whatever they did was in the public domain, and then the rest of the world could build on it, use it, do all kinds of things, take the characters from a book and make new interesting books, all of this sort of stuff. Now, I think that's the way it ought to be. And what's happened to copyright over the last umpty-ump years, like since the 1770s, is that the period of time has extended and extended and extended and extended, and as of January of 2003, a year ago, the Eldred versus Ashcroft case, it was set up as life plus 70. So we take somebody who's young in this audience, let's say 20 years old, you write a book today and live to 90, then the copyright is still good 70 years after that. So 140 years from now, it could still be copyright. So whatever good was in that can't be used by other people. If you're a corporation, then it's a mere 95 years. So that'll protect Mickey Mouse for a long time. The effect of this has been that relatively few things are coming into out of copyright and into the public domain. I think the trend is in the wrong direction. I think the deal with libraries per se was simply that if you put something in the library, people would read it, they would get interested, they might not have read it any otherwise, but then if they read it there, they might think, geez, that's a neat book, I'll go get one of my own, or I like that author, I'll buy the next thing that author produces, or whatever. Maybe that's the short answer to the real question. Yeah?
Can you tell me what a firewall is and how it protects my privacy?
So what's a firewall and how does it protect your privacy? Roughly speaking, a firewall is either software or hardware, but fundamentally a piece of computer program, perhaps built of hardware so it runs faster, that sits between your computer on one side and the wild internet on the other side. And it basically says, stuff coming in, is that okay? Stuff going out, is that okay? Mostly coming in. It looks at what's coming in and says, is it coming from a place that I'm satisfied with? Is it of a type or kind that I'm willing to accept? And if so, I'll let it through. Similarly, going from, I'm not sure which way it's going, but going from inside the computer back out to the internet, it will be, is this going to a site that I'm willing to send things to? Is it something that I had planned to send? And so the firewall is basically has a set of rules about what's legitimate to go in each direction, and it lets the legitimate stuff go through and flags or prevents or warns you about the illegitimate stuff. It's basically just filtering, it's looking at the actual information that's going by, largely in terms of where it's headed and what type of information it is. Is it web traffic? Is it email? Is it finger typing kind of thing? Let me get way in the back corner.
Yes, I've heard several debates about this electronic voting. One of the problems has been there's no way to backtrack it. Once it's been recorded, you have no access to recounting. And the other question that was raised was if someone wanted to change things that had been done already and had worked into access to get into the system, they can change it, and there would be no way of knowing they've done that. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so let me sort of summarize the question. It's basically about electronic voting, and is it, in some sense, secure or safe? I think the answer is today depends. My sense is no, we're definitely not ready. Let me give you several different answers here. There was a proposal that the Pentagon floated some months ago to allow service people outside the United States to vote, particularly in primaries, but then ultimately in the November election as well. And that was going to be, they would walk up to a PC running the right software and they would vote over the internet. This is absolute disaster. This cannot possibly work. And a blue ribbon panel, I know at least a couple of people on that panel, looked at it and said, this cannot possibly work. Here are the, a bunch of threats, all of which are entirely credible. PC software is, as you well know, extremely flaky. The internet, you have no idea where things are going from here, let's say between Iraq and here. So the Pentagon wisely backed off on that one. The kind of electronic voting that is going on, as I understand it, let's say in Georgia right now as we speak, is more constrained. There are machines and polling places that you could think of as sort of like ATM machines that have within them a small program, and they record what the voters do, and then in some way the information is taken from those and sent to some central place for proper counting. But as you say, there's absolutely no way to know what's happened at any stage of that. Because you have no idea what's inside the program. All you have is that the program has sort of been certified by somebody who may or may not know what it does. The audit trail kind of information is very poor. Many of these devices don't give any confirmation to the person who voted that their vote was registered properly. Now, the same is probably true to some extent of voting machines of all ages. But in that sense, there's no trail whatsoever. And it's a difficult technical problem because what you need is something that's anonymous. You don't know who I voted for, but you know I voted, and I have to have something that says I know how I voted, and you have to know that that vote that I made got to the right place and was counted for the right person. It's a difficult, very difficult problem, and there was a flap that you may have noticed a few months ago. Diebold Corporation, which makes many of the voting machines in the United States, had an electronic voting machine and had computer programs in it, and somehow or other some of their internal documents found their way onto the web. The internal documents basically said, geez, this stuff doesn't really work very well. And they were doing a lot of different things of sort of changing programs on the fly, clearly violating the letter of the laws that were set up to arrange their, to make sure that there was a proper control over the software that was running in the machines. And in fact, Diebold tried at one point to use the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to prevent people from further disseminating this very embarrassing information. You may have noticed there were some students at Swarthmore who got a takedown notice because they had posted it on a machine at Swarthmore. I think electronic voting is much too early on. I think it's a very tricky, difficult thing at this point. I think it's still an academic study. There was an article about it, I think, in the paper this morning or maybe yesterday about how difficult it is. We're not there yet. I think it's premature. On the other hand, if you look back in Florida in 2000, it's not at all clear that the old ways were right either. So, yeah.
I just want to come back to the music sharing a little bit. And I think that you made the comment before that if you take that CD and you put it on your website, copy it on your website, you share it with whomever, that's stealing. But if you take that same CD and you play it on the radio station that you own, which most of us grew up listening to the LPs, I guess, and Top 40 and all that, nobody objected to. Isn't that the same kind of sharing?
No, there's a real difference with radio. The way that the radio works, as I understand it, is that when a song is played on the radio, there's actual metering goes on, whether it's done by direct counting or a sampling process. And so they know over a period of time that your song was played 37 times, and so you get some infinitesimal slice of money because of that. So there's actual metering of what's going on the radio. And so what you think of as they're just ripping us off, in fact, that's actually an accounting system that does that kind of stuff. Now, is that a correction of what I just said?
No.
Okay. Because if it's a correction, I'm happy to accept corrections because I don't know the facts. But that's fundamentally, so that's a real difference. Okay, somebody is actually getting money when their song or whatever is played on the radio.
Even when the various DJs would receive all these free records from record companies to promote the records, they were getting a royalty on that.
Fine point. I will take yes for that. Thank you. The lady says yes. I believe it. Okay, back in the corner first.
Perhaps we should turn the question around and maybe publish everything, like on the Napster model, and maybe collect a tax for using that large repository and give the people that get the most hits, like what the music industry does with give them a proportional chunk of that cash. And if you think about it, how wonderful it is to look up an author like Shakespeare or Mozart and get all kinds of information on the internet. And if I look up a contemporary author, right, if I go, let's say in computer science, if I go to ACM or IEEE digital libraries, I have to pay for each digital library. So where am I going to go to get the paper, right? To some preprints or some other place where I can get it. In other words, we're really tying our own feet by trying to live with new technology with the old publication model. And I think that's the case with a lot of, the kind of issues that you mentioned with regard to the technology, the new technologies coming along.
Yeah, in some sense, I hinted at it by saying that I think the recording industry has not brought their business model forward, and I think that that's probably true even more broadly. You can't just sort of give things away and make money at it, but there is an economic principle that says, I think, that people will pay for things, even if they could get them free. They will pay for something because there's value added. Think of the number of people who drink bottled water, right? Okay? It costs more than beer. It's a free good almost, but people will pay for it. And what are they getting from that? They're getting the convenience of packaging. They're getting something where they believe the purity is higher, all kinds of things like that. And so I think that there are quite a few places where you could imagine the same thing. Sort of a subscription model where you say, I'll spend $100 a year, and for that I get absolutely all I can eat of all the journals, all the music, and everything else. My guess is if that were the economic model, everybody in this room would sign up for it because it would be a real boon. I mean, look at cable right now, where you're spending probably $50 a month for stuff, and maybe a tenth of it you actually look at, leaving aside local channels. So I think the models are just wrong. They haven't caught up yet. I think they will happen. I wouldn't care to predict a time scale. We had one over there.
Could you explain what is happening with SEO and Linux and how they can have a copyright on something that's supposed to be open source? How did they manage to get that?
So SEO and Linux and so on. SEO is, I've forgotten what their name is, it's changed so many times, and Linux is open source software. And the theory is that this is one again where I don't know enough, and I should because this is my field. The theory of open source software is that people write programs to do interesting things, and Linux is an operating system. You could think of it as sort of vaguely like Windows. That they write it because it's fun or something like that, and then they put it out in what amounts to the public domain so that others can use it, learn from it, and build on it and make it better. But it's put out under a license which basically says it has to stay in the public domain. You can't take it and make it private. It stays public in that sense. And this company called SEO is basically saying, no, we own the rights to this thing. We're going to take it private. We're going to charge license fees. It's a very specialized kind of discussion, and I don't know a heck of a lot more about it than that, although my instinct says that they're wrong and the good guys are right.
Together, the patent office has a lot of problems dealing with copyrights and other things that they really don't know what to do in situations.
Yeah.
This may be one of them.
Yeah, I don't know, and of course there's a very strong distinction I should make between patents on one side and copyrights on another. So patent protects an idea. You have a great idea, you can patent it, you get the right to exploit it for some period of time, which is what, 17 years or something at this point, maybe, I can't remember. And then that doesn't extend. But that's the idea. And then copyright protects the expression. I wrote a particular thing a particular way. If somebody writes it differently, that's not protected. So there's two different slices of protection. Up there.
I was just going to comment to add to what you said. I think the history is that Unix, of course, was done by you and others at the labs, and then it was sold as a product. And then SEO either changed the name of the company or they bought it. I think they then bought it from this other company that bought it from the labs. And Linux is, some would argue, simply a rewrite of Unix, stealing code left and right from Unix, and that is the connection between Linux and SEO.
Right. And I think what probably is, so is this they stole the code from somebody else, or did they redo it independently? My sense is that it was done independently. That's certainly what it looks like, but boy, if there's ever this, I am not a lawyer applies, this is it. Yeah. Did we have another question somewhere? Ah, Deborah.
This is getting back to something you said at the beginning of your lecture. It interests me. We have a 17-year-old who can talk on the phone and IM and email and write our college applications and listen to the TV and do all of that stuff incredibly quickly. And I think that's all terrific and I admire her. But then when she gets into her English class, she cannot make it through Madame Bovary or Jane Austen, and she says, it's so slow, I can't pay attention to it. And that worries me, as a writer, actually. It worries me a lot. And I wonder if you're familiar at all with the debate about, what does all of this so quickly changing mean for thought?
Right, so the question is then broadly, what is the effect of all of this kind of high-speed digital, high-speed in the way we're supposed to react to it, technology have on what I would call more contemplative things like reading and writing in particular? Is it warping the younger generation in the way that some analogous thing probably warped me when I was a kid? I honestly don't know. I sort of wonder, I look and think perhaps people don't write as well as they used to. They don't have time for it because they're doing all of these other things. You described the person as sort of doing all these things in effect simultaneously, which is something I can't do. So I suspect, yes, it is going to have a change. It will affect a change on people in some form. And like everything else, there will be parts that will be good. It is said that people who play video games are better drivers because their reflexes are faster. I don't know whether this is true or not. And perhaps these people will be much more facile with some other kind of communication at the price of not being able to appreciate some superb piece of literature written 100 or 200 years ago.
What do you do about spam, and what can the average person do?
What do I do about spam, and what can the average person do? Well, since I'm a programmer, I wrote basically a little script that looks at mail and recognizes patterns that I don't accept mail from, like yahoo.com. Sorry if this wounds anybody, msn.com, AOL.com, a lot of that kind of thing. And so I just throw those away. And that kind of, I wrote it for myself because I learned things from doing it. My belief is that you can do the same kind of thing with the typical mail system provided by whoever, MSN or AOL or all these others. They provide filtering, and they're doing the same sort of thing. They're basically looking for either simple-minded patterns, textual patterns, or they're looking for more elaborate patterns, things like suggestive words, porn phrases, lots of things like that, or variations of them, or combinations of things that suggest spam rather than a real legitimate communication. Usually you get a chance to turn those kinds of things on, but it very much depends on what mail system you're using. And I suspect the one I'm using here, because it actually runs on Unix rather than on Windows, is different than probably the average person who's running, let's say, Outlook Express or something like that.
Can I just add something? I know a little about that topic. Also, if it's email from a person you don't know, it suggests that you don't reply to it. Please take me off of these distribution lists, are actually registering your email address as a
Yes.
live email address, and then any photographs or anything like that that's in the email as scripts written behind it that register that you've looked at this email and again register you as a valid email account, and then they sell your email address.
Yes. Yeah, so the observation is that there are a lot of things that happen kind of behind your back, or that happen because you're trying to be a good person and get out from under it. So, ground rule, yes, do not reply to spam. That verifies you exist. So don't do that, and don't click on attachments. In fact, turn off the HTML reader. Don't read mail in HTML because that has, with pictures and all those other things enabled, because as you say, when those are downloaded, then the act of downloading them has sent a message upstream that says, hey, this person is reading my mail, reading my spam to them. So you don't want to do that. And so that's another thing that's different. I don't read mail with an HTML-enabled reader. Yes?
I have a contract with Comcast for their high-speed net. And it seems to me that the ads that I'm getting now, I did not get before I had high speed. The ads are
guessing everybody, so the question is, what do you do when you're getting this enormous collection of advertisement, and is it an artifact of signing up for a new server or new service? And the answer is, I don't know, and about the, is it a byproduct of signing up for new? It sounds like not. And turning them off, there are things that you can do to turn off pop-ups in particular. There's a thing called pop-up stopper. If you get that and enable it, then you don't get so many of them anymore. And maybe that's the one single thing that I would suggest right now. And people have to escape, by the way. I keep this up indefinitely, but I know that some people definitely have to go.